Welcome back. I'm Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it's a pleasure to sort of help to conduct this second part. Very interesting discussion on the report in the Americas and the world, public opinion and foreign policy in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. For this part, in addition of Guadalupe and Jorge, we are joined by Peter Hakim, President Emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue, Kevin Casa Zamora, Acting Director of Latin American Initiative at Brookings, the Brookings Institution, and Stephen Johnson, Director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I think the best way to do this, I don't know, Peter, do you want to go first?
No, but I will.
Okay, that's what I like about Peter. You were volunteered.
Let me say that this was a hard assignment to try to comment on all this. I mean, there's just a huge array of information covering a wide range of topics. It was sort of what we call TMI, too much information. And I think that I'm going to turn down any invitation to talk about a work that's essentially a reference work. It's not really a narrative or an explanation as much as it's a very useful sort of to go and sort of sense what is going on. And it's particularly useful, I would think, when you have a question that you want to know something and you can go here and you get an answer to it. If you don't have a question, just to read this, it's very hard to figure out, sort of how do you remember it, how do you relate it to anything. It's sort of up in the air, all this information, and it's only when you have a specific research question that you want to bring it down and sort of try it out on. I found it in reading it, though, and I would certainly recommend anybody go through it from stem to stern. I found it too useful. First, what it specifically tells you is very useful. You just sort of see the differences among the countries, the similarities, which I'm going to get to in a second, because I think that if there's one thing that I thought was a little bit off in your explanations is I think there are more similarities than different. You tended to emphasize differences, and I think in many cases the differences weren't as great, but I'm going to get back to that. But the second thing, it really made me think of a lot of issues that I just didn't think about. Why would anyone care about this issue? And then, to say why, for example, which is one of the things that consistently puzzled me, was why are Colombians so well-informed, or apparently well-informed, compared to Brazilians? Well, where's Paulo Sotero? Just to begin, when you begin to think about these questions, these subsidiary questions, it's a very fascinating read. The one question that is not answered, and maybe you do have the answer, Jorge Guadalupe, is what is your sense, and this is, I hope you'll answer, of how people reach their conclusions? Do they reach them the same in each country? Or, for example, does the press or television have a huge importance in Mexico, but personal experience is more important in Ecuador? How do people, is it, what is it? And is there a difference between urban and rural, for example? Some sort of, and I just don't have any sense what it is that, where do people get their, and then, of course, whether there was no relationship to the actual way that countries behave internationally. Mm-hmm. In other words, the fact that Colombians know better the President of the United States, why is that? And what does that imply for, if anything? The most important thing that's missing, and there was a question raised at the end that I thought was going to get at this in destroy what I was going to say, but it would be just terrific to see a comparison with a group of Asian countries, a group of European countries, a group of African. Why? Because we don't know if there's a Latin American perspective on these issues. In other words, when we see one country at 43% and another at 57%, you say, look at the difference. But let's say, the Asian countries are all between 10 and 20. So you have and to take one very concrete example of why a comparison would really illuminate, I think, a lot, is when you talked about the rights of immigrants, you talked about it as being that the Latin Americans were almost hypocritical, that they sort of wanted these rights for themselves but weren't willing to give them. And I would say, if you looked at the way, let's say, Chinese or Korean, if the difference was even greater, you would say maybe Latin Americans are more tolerant than others, though. It's not surprising that people sort of, when they see the question, say, this is good for me personally, and another question, so it's not a question. I'm not sure that people link those two questions, and it'd be interesting to see comparisons. Again, I find this is just one. I was not as surprised as you seem to be, and maybe I was wrong in that, about how much smarter the Colombians seem to be than everybody else. That all these international organizations have been poking around in Colombia. I mean, it's not surprising that they have a view of the OAS. The OAS is there, was working on demobilizing the paramilitaries. And in Brazil, the OAS just is not there. And so I think that there is some sort of degree, and that's when you talk about small versus large, it's because the OAS doesn't get involved very often. For example, I'm just taking that as an example. And again, that how people get their information is important. I'm going to leave it at that and give my colleagues a chance to comment as well. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Peter.
Very useful, very interesting, and entertaining, too.
Kevin, would you go next, please?
Thank you, Pablo. Is this thing working? Yes, it is. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers, to the Wilson Center, to Andrew, just left, and to the authors of this report. As Peter just said, it's been really fascinating to read, and I agree totally with the fact that it's just too much information to comment on in 10 minutes. So, I got 10 minutes and 5 points to make. 2 points are regional in nature, then 2 points about specific countries, and a final substantive reflection about the democratic nature of foreign policy. My first point is that I take issue with the assertion made in the conclusion of the report that there's no potential to build a common agenda with the U.S., or only a low potential. Quite to the contrary, I would say. Yes, there is a reservoir of distrust towards the U.S. in Mexico, but, you would kind of expect that. But all things considered, the opinions about the U.S. in the survey are remarkably positive. The country is nearly the best regarded of all. It is admired. The U.S. is more trusted. I mean, this is remarkable. The U.S. government is more trusted than some of the Latin Americans' own political institutions, and so on and so forth. And some of the issues that Latin Americans want their governments to prioritize in their foreign policy make that partnership natural. The most obvious case is the fight against drug trafficking and organized crime that seems to be one of the most important concerns across the region. And it's actually interesting to notice the very large majorities, just a small example, the very large majority is in favor of extradition of criminals in all countries. So, I mean, that's one issue. The potential for partnership also stems from the strikingly positive, and this would, deserve a separate comment, I guess, the strikingly positive views about globalization, free trade, foreign investment that seem prevalent in the 5 countries under study, particularly in those that have done very well economically in the recent past. And one can even mention the issue of climate change that appears at the top of the foreign policy priorities for Latin Americans, and that the U.S. will have, will seriously have to deal with, hopefully sooner rather than later. I guess if the U.S. finally comes to its senses on the issue of climate change, it will have more than willing partners in the hemisphere. So after reading the report, I'm much more optimistic about the feasibility of a true hemispheric partnership to tackle some key global issues. The question, of course, is whether the U.S. will decide to build on that reservoir of goodwill, on the shared values, and on the very dense social links created by the Latin American migration to the U.S. The U.S., in my view, has an enormous strategic opportunity to build a hemispheric partnership if it decides to invest political capital in it, and if and only if treats Latin America with respect as a partner. And I want to underscore the strategic value of this for the U.S. For the U.S., strengthening its partnership with Latin America can be a long-term antidote to the erosion of its relevance in the world. And here, I recall a conversation with Felipe González. Felipe González was recounting one of his probably many encounters with President Mitterrand. And they were talking about Latin America, and Felipe was telling Mitterrand how the Spanish were taking very seriously their relationship with Latin America because it offered a lot of potential for Spain, and they have done so. And Mitterrand's comment was something along the lines of Monsieur González, what France could do if it had Latin America on its side. I guess the U.S. would be well advised to do the same. In 50 years' time, when the U.S. is no longer the largest economy in the world, and today's political, environmental, energy problems have really taken a toll, a close partnership in the Western Hemisphere perhaps could allow the U.S. to do things that would not be able to do on its own. And I guess, there are precedents for this. I mean, on a different scale, perhaps, that notion of not being able, being part of a partnership to be able to do things that one cannot do on its own, what's precisely what France, for instance, realized very early in the day at the dawn of the EU. So the potential for a partnership seems to be there, and it's one that the U.S. would do well to take seriously. My second point is about the very pragmatic view among Latin Americans of regional integration, which is great. In this, I think the public is getting it right. The integration that really matters is not the grand political schemes championed at the summits, but the integration that builds roads and facilitates trade. And I posit here that a 4-lane highway between Ecuador and Peru, or a high-tension electric grid between Colombia and Venezuela, do much more for regional integration than 10 presidential summits. Moreover, given the mess in which developed economies find themselves in, I do think that regional economic integration is an agenda that Latin America would do well advised to take very seriously today. And we have ways to go on that front. And I'll just give you one figure. I mean, intra-regional trade in East Asia is about 35% of the total trade for those countries. Mm-hmm. In South America, it is less than 20%. And it's indeed lower than it was a decade ago. And within Mercosur, it's about 15%. So the potential for growth is immense, and we should take it seriously, particularly now. So a regional economic and fiscal integration is an agenda that deserves urgent attention, and that, moreover, as the report shows, has public opinion in Latin America behind it. Number 3, one comment about Venezuela. You know, we may argue here about whether the Bolivarian Revolution has been good or bad for domestic policy in Venezuela. You know, I tend to lean in a particular way, but let's leave it at that. But I have no doubt that when it comes to foreign policy achievements, particularly in terms of the image of Venezuela, it has been an abject failure. You know, forget the delusions of grandeur of Commander Chavez of being able to bring about a new world order and so on. I mean, a new world order is indeed emerging, but its emergence has nothing to do with Chavez. It is that Venezuela's image in Latin America has suffered mightily in the past decade. The image of Venezuela, of Chavez himself, of ALBA, is overwhelmingly negative in the region. And I would imagine that this makes Venezuela far less influential in the region than Chavez imagined it to be. The report shows very clearly why, apart from the very peculiar Daniel Ortega and perhaps Evo, there are hardly any political leaders in the region that are rushing to appear in the same picture with Chavez. And I will venture something else, and I might take some heat for this. You know, Newt Gingrich is my model now. Seeing the information in this report, I'm almost convinced that the Venezuela of Carlos Andrés Pérez of 35 years ago was more influential in Latin America than the Venezuela of Chavez today. 4, a comment about Mexico, which is the other story that, to me, stands out. The report shows not merely that Mexico is a very pessimistic country at the moment, but that it is a torn country. It really doesn't know where it belongs. It regards itself, from the cultural standpoint, quite clearly as a Latin American country, but also knows that it is bound in myriad ways to the U.S. and feels, apparently, that the future of its relationship with Latin America is rather uncertain, and that a leadership role in the region is most certainly beyond its grasp. The elites in Mexico, it seems to me, made a decision in the 90s of decoupling Mexico from Latin America, which is fine. But I don't think they did a very good job explaining the rationale of that decision to their citizens. What one perceives is that the public and even the elites themselves feel rather uncomfortable with being neither here nor there. They have reaped some tangible benefits of their close links to the U.S., but one senses that at this point in time, the terrible violence linked to drug trafficking has brought home some of the palpable downsides of being so closely linked to the U.S. The result is a foreign policy that is extraordinarily confusing and not befitting an important country like Mexico. And here, there may be an interesting example in Turkey, an interesting example that might hold a few valuable lessons for Mexico. I mean, Turkey was torn between Europe and the Middle East for the longest time. And I guess in the past decade or so, it realized that it didn't have to choose, that it could have its own voice on international affairs. But to do that, you need a strategy. And I really can't see any in the case of Mexico. And I don't think, and that's what the report suggests, I don't think that the Mexican society does see a strategy either. My last point, it's, I guess, a methodological or even a philosophical question. which is, what is the use of opinion polls when it comes to foreign policy? I once read in one of Giovanni Sartori's books a very acid take on this question. I mean, saying that, well, the problem with opinion polls was that they ask people what they believe, but not what they know about something. And this is a perfect example of this. Mind you, to the credit of the authors, they do ask people what they know about foreign policy. And the answer, generally speaking, is very little. So I guess, my sense is that people are, and that's what I've seen in my own country and I guess a little bit in other countries. I mean, people are not interested in foreign policy until and unless it directly affects their lives. In democratic debates, foreign policy is a dessert. It's a delicacy for connoisseurs. That's what it is. So polls tell us, I guess, which foreign policy projects or possible directions or options are more or less viable to the extent that they have the people behind them. But they tell us very little about the drivers that move foreign policy elites to make decisions. People are ill-equipped to gauge the strategic calculations that are the stuff foreign policy is made of on a daily basis. So foreign policy projects and decisions are almost inevitably the province of elites. And there's nothing wrong in that. We can quote a long list of examples of truly pivotal foreign policy decisions that were made with very little input from the people. I mean, I don't think that Ataturk, sat down and thought of ways of bringing the people behind him, when he decided to bring Turkey closer to the West. And I don't think the European leaders did that after the war. So foreign policy is made by elites, not by the people. So what public opinion says regarding foreign policy is useful, but tells us a very limited part of the story. So my concrete recommendation, and with this I finish, is that we need a companion volume to this one, asking elites in Latin America how they see the world, how they see the relationship with the U.S., how they see the relationship with the rest of Latin America. And I certainly encourage the authors to undertake that project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, Stefan.
I come from a small town in Wyoming originally, and I remember that the TV station hired a young man to read the sports on weekends, and he had kind of a habit where he would start to slow down, and the cameraman would give him this signal to try and wrap it up, to speed it up. And so one Saturday night he did that, and he did it by eliminating the teams from the scores that he was reading, so that instead of the Dodgers against the Yankees 5-1, he started going, and it was 8-2, 4-0, and we had a tie at 5-5. Well, that's kind of how I felt about halfway through this exposition. This is a very good report, but in order to make something of it, you really have to sit down with it and contemplate it over a while and begin to use the numbers in arguments and studies that where they begin to fall into a kind of a context, because there is so much information in here. But I think in characterizing what I heard this afternoon, to me there are no surprises. And I think that's good to confirm. It seems like people in Latin America, according to this, and the countries that were studied, seem to be an awful lot like people in the United States, especially in parts of the United States where people really don't travel very much and even our own Congress, which I was reminded this afternoon, we have about 5% of the members who actually do any kind of traveling. So contact with the outside world actually would be helpful on both north and south sides of the hemisphere. As much as we'd like to believe that each country has exceptional circumstances that may tie to particular events of the time, I'm sort of reminded of similar views by people who used to come and visit me from Ecuador back in 2000 and would tell me about how the conflict in Colombia was pushing displaced refugees and migrants into their country, and how they had such a hard time defending their borders, to the point that one small town that used to be known as Santo Domingo de los Colorados suddenly acquired the name Santo Domingo de los Colombianos. And according to them, worst of all, they brought their music. So some of these things do have kind of a history, and I think if you notice a little bit of concern on the part of Ecuadorians' part about Colombia, it may be because of the problems that have existed historically, and so this may have kind of a legacy to it. Hard power versus soft power. Latin American countries don't have an awful lot of hard power to exercise, so I think it would be only natural that soft power would be something that they see as being much more useful than, say, military force. The United States being seen as in a more favorable light than some of their own institutions. I don't think that necessarily would have been the case in 2004, so that might be more of a temporal thing. Brazil's leadership, certainly with the countries that were studied in the report, Brazil would probably come out fairly far ahead because of its creativity and also the initiative that it took on such things as UNASUR and the South American Defense Council, developing a sort of a strategic development and defense plan, which was very well received, and I think some countries are trying to copy. Colombia, on the other hand, a close friend of the United States, probably would draw some raised eyebrows because of that, and also because of the skill that it demonstrated in pulling itself out of a very difficult situation. Mexico, I think probably the pregnant question that needs to be asked in this report, and maybe a follow-up for it, would be what is happening with its law enforcement, justice, and civic institutions. Are Mexicans ready to make really big changes, or are they still in denial about the things that they seem to be clinging to? And then there have been a number of articles, I guess, in our own press that have tried to delve into how much certain countries, certain people in certain countries look to the past and sort of have a very fond remembrance of it. And we all know that when we look into the past, we tend to see things better than they actually were. And Argentina and Mexico tend to come up in those conversations. It'd be very interesting to see you do a kind of a side study on that in the future, particularly as it affects political psychology. Overall, I thought it was a very useful exercise, and hope you do more, and particularly on your home country, Mexico.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I'll make just few observations about Brazil. I'm not surprised at all by the report's conclusions, but I have some observations to make. If you would have made this study 5 or 10 years ago, all the values that you see as more negative in terms of it would be much worse than they are today. So if you see this as a video, Brazil is much more disposed vis-a-vis the rest of the world, integration, etc. This is a first observation. It's a pity that you didn't break it down by age groups. You sense there is optimism in Brazil. If you go to the people under 30, it's enormous optimism. It's not optimism. Kids are really, this is our time. And I have that. I go to Brazil all the time, and I lecture to young people. And there was even a sort of a defeatist attitude in Brazil in the old days, self-criticism that was sort of destructive. And I always test this. Say, guys, do you remember this thing that we used to say that in Brazil, we cannot do anything, right? Come on, we're Brazilians. We're, it's we have even an expression, avacalhado. Everything is a little bit, half-baked, etc. And then I said, so we are like that. And the kid said, no, we are not. Whatever is wrong, we are fixing it, and we are doing it now. So the attitude, the sense of optimism that is clearly detected, captured by the survey is very much there. On isolation, a sense of isolation. Part of that derives from the poor social indications, especially on education. The percentage of people in Brazil that do not speak a foreign language. This is now a problem for Brazilian economy. Companies in Brazil are dying for people speaking English. Brazil last year admitted 1 million people with work permits. If you are an engineer and you speak Portuguese or something sounds like it, you have a job. The Portuguese, actually, Brazil is going to Portugal, and you're going to Spain and to neighboring countries. They come. You're welcome. Everybody. Because we need. We have 30,000 engineers graduated each year. We need 60,000. And so this is a different, again, on isolation, if it is true, all the information, it's not surprising, but Brazil has today identified more or less 35 multinational companies. And about 15 of those are very aggressive, and they are all over the place, in the continent and in Africa and in Europe and here and in other places. So to say that Brazil is sort of not aware of the world, Brazilians are not aware of the world, well, not in the foreign languages, etc., but if you say Embraer, Odebrecht, Camargo Correia, Vale, they are very aware, and they know where they are. What the report, actually, there is a comment in the report that I find very correct. Brazil, in contrast with other countries, has the characteristics of a continental country. Continental countries tend to be self-sufficient. Go to China, come to the United States. Ask the Russians, India, those countries they tend to be self-referential. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I think it's mostly bad. But that's the way they are. So if Brazil makes a lot of progress in terms of integrating itself more and more, it will not change substantially because it is a continental nation. 31% or 33% of Brazilians being connected with the internet, this is the Mexican population. The number of Brazilians connected to the internet. So so absolute size means something. There is one thing that I found a pity on page 18 on identity. And I really urge you, next time you do the survey, ask Brazilians, ask the question, are you a Latin American? The answer will be, most of the times, I see some Brazilians here that I know the answer. It will be a long pause. If the answer is not an immediately no, it's I am Brazilian, that's normally the answer, there will be a long pause. The polite ones will say, yeah, culturally maybe. But that is the attitude, because there is a sense of identity in Brazil, because we did not have an indigenous population. Well, the one that was there was basically gone by the early last century, is now actually has tripled since then. But Brazil is much more of an African nation than a Latin American nation, and it's an Italian nation, a German nation. You sense there is the thermometer you had there about, you saw that Japan was at the top because the survey was done around the tsunami time, I think. Brazil has the largest Japanese immigration, and Japan has the second or third largest, second or third largest community of foreigners in Japan are made of Brazilians. And at the time of tsunami, the radio, and international Japanese television, or the Japanese television, was broadcasting in Korean, Chinese, and in Portuguese. So that's just because of the moment you had the survey. That's why people in Brazil were really worried about the tsunami, because they have relatives there and there's this huge connection with Japan. Other things that I find, again, on the optimism, optimism is Brazil's middle name. It has always been. When I was growing up, until I was about 30, the idea that Brazil was going to become an important country, there has always been in Brazil. It has to do with size. There's ambition that comes with that, a vision, and then that was lost, and it has been recovered in democracy. There is some, I recommend you to read a profile of Dilma Rousseff just out in the New Yorker magazine. And there is an observation that's very interesting that Tom Shannon, the U.S. ambassador to Brazil, makes, which I find it very true. I don't know if it's going to remain true or not. I have no idea if Brazil will rise or will not rise, because it depends on things that happen outside of Brazil, and especially on things that challenges in Brazil regarding infrastructure, education, better tax policies, and stuff like that. But it is that this is the first time, this is Tom Shannon speaking, this is the first time that a nation rises to global prominence based on soft power only, which is a very interesting proposition. The idea that Kevin mentions of developing a vision of a regional vision, etc., as you probably would guess, Brazilians are not very high on that. Why? Because we are not only there, but separate. Brazil is now 60% of South America's economy. Brazil is now 40% of Latin American and Caribbean economy. If current trends continue, Brazil will be even a bigger proportion, which causes an enormous problem, especially for, including the diplomats. In a country where the survey shows very well, there is no constituency, domestic constituency, outside of the business community and a bunch of journalists and professors, for a foreign policy that pays attention to the region, which is a challenge. Brazil has the responsibility to, it's in its own interest to do so. But it's an enormous challenge, I think, to be a diplomat in Brazil and try to develop that strategy, because there is no domestic constituency for that, and people will, will challenge it. Well, why do we have to do that? And we do. And we do have to develop intelligent, if we are intelligent as a nation, hopefully we are going to grow and develop in an inclusive way, in a way that our prosperity is shared. That's the intelligent way of going about that. But this has to be worked out. And, again, the business community in Brazil, not the government, is driving integration. The government, to the extent that the BNDES supports lots of activities of Brazilian companies in neighboring nations. And about the surveys, one final thing, there are some surveys of Brazilian elite thinking. Amaury de Souza produced a couple. It's very interesting because the opinion is very divided. For instance, Brazil's rise in the world, or no rise in the world, is the region a platform? Is Brazil, is the region, the geographic region, a platform for Brazil to project itself, or just Brazil should project itself because it is a continental nation, and this is very much a subject on, being debated in Brazil. But I think that if you, in the next survey, could really ask more questions about Brazil, or ask all the questions to Brazilians also, and if you could break
Just
it
do
down.
Brazil, I think.
No, but it's, and include more nations. To reinforce something that someone said here, I think if you go to the continental nations and ask those questions, you're going to have about the same results. Doesn't surprise me, because there is, in Brazil, we refer to, still to this day, we refer to the rest of the world as lá fora, which means there, outside. And continental countries have that attitude. They think that the world starts and ends where they are, which doesn't. But it informs their thinking, although I completely agree, if you improve education achievement in Brazil, some of those indicators of the ignorance about the rest of the world will change, and they need to go down. We need to become more knowledgeable, because the Brazilian economy, forget about leadership, the Brazilian economy needs that. Now, questions from the audience. Difficult questions, please. No question. Tom.
Yeah, I heard earlier the reason why you only focused on these 5 countries in Latin America, but it is kind of interesting that you picked 3 Andean states, yet no country in the Spanish-speaking Southern Cone. You also picked no country in Central America either, and I'm wondering if that would have made a difference in terms of the responses. And I ask this because I've seen other surveys, for example, particularly asking questions dealing with foreign policy, where Argentina, for example, usually has very negative viewpoints about the United States, for example.
Ask Argentinians if they are Latin Americans. That's another interesting one. Questions, or if yes?
I just wanted to know, why is that the questionnaire is so different from Brazil and the other countries? I mean, why is that there are so less questions in Brazil than the other countries? And just I wanted to know, how did you make these questionnaires? I mean, why are they different?
I think it was the first time the survey was applied in Brazil. Yeah. One more, yes, and then okay. Let's do this, have a round, and then go back.
I just had a question on the notion of the U.S. as an adversary. The imperial adversary has, as you've pointed out, diminished and maybe even disappeared. And how will this affect free trade agreements with countries like Ecuador, in defense agreements, and will it be everlasting into the future, or is it going to be short-lived?
Well, let's come back to the table. Kevin, do you want to go first, and then we? I think we'll pick one of the questions, or if not, we.
No, I think I'll pass.
Okay.
I think they were more for the authors.
Steve, do you want to say something?
I would just say on the kinds of agreements, generally agreements with the United States depend on 2 things: mutual interest and leadership. And depending on the proclivity of the diplomats that are in charge and have positions in which they can negotiate things, I think will be successful, because they'll figure out a way to plug into different interests. And I only say that kind of based on my own experience in the Pentagon at a time when we took what basically were 3 bilateral working agreements in the hemisphere and basically doubled them, and I think we've got it up to about 8 now. But it depends on if that's what you really want to do, and if you've got something that countries can plug into for mutual interest. And I think the survey kind of indicates that, where there are things that countries can agree on that are in their benefit, then they tend to see them favorably. And so part of diplomacy, I think, on our part, is being able to identify those things and capitalize on them.
Peter?
Well, just one thing. I think, and maybe I'm wrong, and the authors will tell me, but I don't think it's a good idea to try to take this survey and sort of impute foreign policy from it. I think this represents a poll of people, presumably representative poll. Doesn't tell you what Brazil's foreign policy is, nor does it tell you what it's going to be or if anyone's going to pay attention to this. What it tells you is how generally people feel about, and it's sort of more of a cultural expression almost than necessarily a tool for interpreting foreign policy. But that may be wrong.
Yeah, Guadalupe.
Well, let me pick on this comment to make a very strong point on this. What we would like to do in the long run with this exercise is to have a better sense of the international political culture of Latin Americans. It's more a political culture approach to the questions than just measuring a public opinion. And we feel very strongly to keep on doing this. Because in the long run, we would like to see how values, norms, identities, information change the way people think about politics. Either it's international or national, because we are moving towards a world that will be increasingly internationally ruled. Actually, nowadays, many rules are done in the international system, not necessarily only by states. So that's our long-term purpose. Going to the question about why these countries and whether if we had another a country from Central America or the Southern Cone, results might be different. Of course. Actually, we know, for example, from the previous survey that we conducted it in Chile, that there is, in Chile, for example, there is a strong consensus among everything in terms of international relations. And let me pick on this in order to comment about Kevin's point when public opinion matters in terms of foreign policy. It matters. It never matters until it matters. And it's funny the way some international issues politicize. And you never know when they are going to become part of the hardcore domestic debate. It might be war, or it might be, as in the case of Mexico, for example, ideological struggles. The question with Cuba and the vote in the United Nations against Iraq, against the use of force in Iraq, was something that had mainly to do with ideological partisanship struggle than anything else. So, but I think that in general, it reflects how social preferences are distributed in a society. And when these preferences are polarized, so the leaders have much more difficulty to figure out about public policies. But when these social attitudes are more into the center, or more ambivalent, that's something that we see in Latin America, so the elites have leeway to do whatever they want, in a sense. So they have more room for defining policy.
Can I have
Kevin, yeah,
a
sure.
finger on that one? No, I mean, I think it's it's fair what you're saying. My point perhaps is that it is very rarely that elites, no matter how polarized the opinion can be, the intensity of opinions regarding foreign policy in most countries is very low. So it's only very rare that elites actually pay attention to opinion polls in the process of making foreign policy decisions. That's my point. You find the rare occasion. And my contention is that those occasions come only when a particular option in foreign policy has very concrete implications for the livelihoods of people in the country.
That's not quite right. I mean, if there's one incident where, in fact, they was done precisely to get people involved in foreign policy was when Argentina decided to invade the Malvinas. Had nothing to do with the Argentine pocketbook, but it generated enormous support immediately for a very discredited military. It's purely symbolic. And so I think, it's the kind of issue, not that it affects the pocketbook, but somehow these kinds of, I think Ecuador,
but that only
that
goes
explains I think between Ecuador's responses, I interpreted them largely through the Peru-Ecuador competition and the distaste more recently for Colombia and the differences. But they see themselves surrounded by hostile actors.
Peter, but that only goes to prove my point. I mean, I don't think Galtieri checked the opinion polls before invading the Malvinas.
I think he pretty much knew that everybody from...
And in any case, it was a decision made by elites.
But based on what they knew would be the reaction.
Peter, was an exploitation of an enormous sentiment that exists in Argentina, an irresponsible exploitation by a dying bunch of torturers, the regime, and they got more or less what they thought was to be beaten by an army conducted by a lady from England. So that was an anomaly. But if you think about those things, it's really, for instance, what Obama is doing today, basically bringing troops back, etc. I think he is responding to what could be verified as majority of public opinion in the United States that thinks maybe that's time to do.
Obama? Are you kidding?
Obama is withdrawing, and because maybe it's time, I think, it's my reading, it's not, as someone said, it's time to do nation building in the United States. Maybe, and I think it reflects that sense, and so, countries will, leaders will, I know that in Brazil, people will not think what the people think about what we are going to do in this area of foreign policy, because this debate happens in a very small sector. But they get the answer when, for instance, Brazil does this effort with Iran and Turkey and Brazil, which I happens to be a well-intentioned, badly executed exercise. People react badly, negatively in Brazil because of the outcome. But I think in the countries in the region, I don't know that there is a very much of a constituency for this or that foreign policy. I may be, from the perspective of Brazil, I know that happens to be the case. Yes.
Just one final comment. I couldn't agree more that we have too much information in this survey, and what we always get when we present it is that people want even more information from the comments that they made. Yes, what we are doing here is we're presenting an overview of foreign policy and public opinion in Latin America. I was in Shanghai 2 months ago, and I was invited to a 25-course dinner, which was the most impressive thing on earth because 25. So they just brought you small pieces of different regional dishes of China, and I was lucky enough to be seated next to the president of the Shanghai International Studies Institutes, And he explained me each and every one of the dishes that was presented to me, obviously what it was, from which region of China it came, how it was cooked. And it was the best probably immersion to real Chinese cuisine that I've had in my whole life. And from that moment on, Chinese cuisine is not what I used to think about. We just hope that we're doing exactly the same with this survey and with this report, in the sense that what we are doing is providing a public good, which is data, which is information, for you to make your own questions, whichever they are, and have information which is very rigorously obtained and very solid academically to answer your own questions. What we do at CEDA is we have the seminars with the students for them to write their thesis or their dissertations, and what we've done in the past is we've found almost 65 questions in one single seminar of 2 hours on which a dissertation could be written, just inductively thinking on the data that we have on this survey. So what we would like you to do is just use the information to pass from the level of opinion to the level of argument based on the survey. And what we would like to do is have academia, but also media, and also policymakers use this information for their everyday work. And for example, only 1 week ago, the Mexican Journal of Foreign Affairs published a special issue on foreign policy and public opinion in Latin America, using the data of the survey to try to explain how Latin American foreign policy in several countries is actually made, and to what extent is it representative of the interests of the majority of the populations. So it can be very well used academically. And politically, let me give you one example which is beautiful. The Mexican Minister of Foreign Affairs had their deposition before the Senate 1 year ago, and she used several data from the survey to make several arguments and to defend her foreign policy. And the next moment, the senators from the PRI and the PRD used the same data from the survey to bash the Mexican Minister of Foreign Affairs. So information is useful as long as you know how to use it. So please use it as widely as you can. And to answer the Brazil question on why it's so different, is because the Brazilians, in order to get the funding, used the 2008 survey, and they translated it to Portuguese to get the funding. And then time got onto them, and they had to conduct the survey, and they didn't realize that they used the survey of 2008 instead of the survey of 2010 to conduct it, and therefore we only share with them approximately 45% of the questions, and we share approximately 90% of the questions with the other countries, because what we do is we have a core questionnaire which all countries replicate, and we also have free questions for the countries to conduct the specific questions which are relevant for the country of their choice. For 2012, we hope to have 15 countries of the Americas in which we all share at least 60 questions, and we will also be doing it jointly with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs and hopefully with Spain.
Okay, 3 more questions. I saw one here, there, and there. Yes, the gentleman, yes, is right here.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of comments and a question. I think that I agree. Data is data. You know, it's what you make of it. Mm-hmm. But again, polls are always somewhat tricky. Like you know, this may be because if you follow strictly what you say there, maybe the next Equatorial campaign is going to be as xenophobic as possible. You know, based on the information we get here. Which I think that it's not just a question of what data is there, what the people think, but what you do about what they're thinking. The other point that I wanted to make has to do with excuse me, but I'll bring the competition up. The Latin Barometer, which also takes somewhat similar approaches to this, and they've made somewhat of a more of a well, they have enough surveys that they have more of a trend. Could you comment on whether there are any significant variations between what they get and what you get, please? Thank you.
There is a question here. Yes. Is there a mic?
Hi. No, actually, I was really interested on your observation in the debate that you had that usually it's the elites that do the foreign policy. The elites.
My observation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, I want to bring up I I mean, like the rise of the civil society. For me, it's like very symptomatic that Brazil is the country that we have the word social forum so many times. And I think I don't know if in a national level, but more in a, I don't know, in a global level, in a regional level, I think the civil society is like taking account the foreign policy. Because, for example, if you look at Brazil and if you look at the dispute of the patents, I think was 2002, and I don't think, I doubt that Brazil would won the case and U.S. would remove the claim if, for example, Brazil would have the support of Oxfam and Médecins Sans Frontières. I would like you to comment on that, like the rise of the civil society. For example, if you see Brazil, if you see the major social movements in Brazil today, for example, the landless movement. The landless movement, they have a sector. There's international policy, foreign policy, like social movements in Brazil, they have their own foreign policy. And like U.S. come here. The landless movements come here in U.S. to New York in October, for example, to say that the Brazilian policy that favors the agribusiness is wrong, that does not take care of the food security, and United Nations and the FAO. Actually, the director of FAO, it's José Graziano Silva. That's one of the
former minister in Brazil.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I really think it counts, and I really think like we lose a lot of the data, a lot of the facts, a lot of the reality if we don't look at that, if we don't take into account. So
okay,
that's my observation.
One more. We have one, and that's going to be it.
Hello, my name is Emmanuel. I'm also from Brazil. Actually, my question is regarding education. We know that Brazil is now experiencing a great growth rate. On the other hand, we're losing some job seats to foreigners. We know that the rates of enrollment in Brazil are almost 100% in primary education. On the other hand, disenrollment rates are big according to some projects and programs from the federal government, like Bolsa Escola, Bolsa Família. On the other hand, we don't have, according to the international standards and according to some researches and exams that students do in Brazil, we don't have a good level of quality in education. So we have most of all the kids at school, but they don't learn. They are taught English, but they cannot speak. And so my question is, until when Brazil can support the development rates with this poor education we have?
Okay. Yes, you please, and that's going to be.
Thank you to both the commentators and the authors, and this is a question for the authors. From your survey findings, were you able to get a general sense or at least an explanation as to why the general Mexican opinion has to do with the paradoxes of migration? Why is it, you mentioned the paradoxes of migration, and I found this very interesting, but were you able to get a sense of it just from serving the people? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Let me go.
Yeah, Guadalupe. You want to go first? Okay. Kevin.
My point is very brief. Civil society and foreign policy. Well, I agree with you. I think civil society matters. You can say as much about domestic policy too. The general point is that civil society matters more in public debates now than it was the case before. But I would caution in one sense, which is that the influence of civil society when it comes to foreign policy, and I would reckon that also in domestic policy, matters when there's a specific issue at stake. When what is at stake is the strategic orientation of foreign policy, I really doubt it that civil society has anything to say when it comes to that. When there's a very specific issue at stake, yes, because that's the nature of civil society. I mean, most civil society organizations are structured and articulated around issues. And when that issue comes to the fore, then they have voice in the debate. But the strategic lines of foreign policy, I very much doubt it. I think that's still the province of elites.
Yeah. Steve, you want to?
No, I have no comment on that.
Okay. Guadalupe, please.
Okay, on the Latino Barometro question, we don't see the Latino Barometro as our competition. Actually, we were quite close. Some of our consultants are part of Latino Barometro. We see our survey more as a complementary thing. It's very difficult to cover in just one survey the whole thing you want to cover. So we specialized in international affairs, but there are two important differences. First of all, we have this public access to all our data, and also we are anchored in academic. All the research project is anchored in academic institutions. But the interesting thing is that our findings are quite consistent with them, which means that we are both doing the right thing. We are doing it right. I think it's very interesting to look, to have better knowledge about the elites. And in the survey, we interview a group of leaders, and we have found several things that might explain how easy or not is to make up a foreign policy in a country like Mexico. What we found, for example, is that Mexican elites nowadays are quite segmented. We found traditional elites, mainly politicians, government officials, and the entrepreneurs, which are much more statu quo kind of vision of the world. And then we have a different elites, which are mainly media, academics, and NGOs, which are much more critical. And we also found a group of leaders which is more divided along partisan and ideological lines than the population. And that might explain to you a little bit why it has been very difficult for Mexico to figure out its uncomfortable geopolitical position, because it's not always been comfortable at all. But Mexico had a grand strategy before, and it had a second grand strategy with with NAFTA, and now NAFTA stopped, and Mexico found itself in a very difficult position. So that's part of the division within the elites might explain the difficulty to find a new strategy. And just a final word on U.S. image. You asked something about that. When you look the changes over time, we see that in Latin America, anti-Americanism is contingent, and it depends on two things: on the quality of U.S. policies towards the region, and on the image of the American president. Those things matter a lot in terms of U.S. image in Latin America.
I will leave the education question to Paulo because he's the expert. So I will talk about the paradoxes of migration. Mexico is a country of emigration. We've been doing it for over 100 years, and today, as you very well know, there are 30 million people of Mexican origin living in the U.S., from which 15 million were born in Mexico, and from which between 6 to 8 million are here in an undocumented way. Mexico is not a country of immigration. We've only had small waves of immigration, European at the beginning of the 20th century, Spanish in the Spanish Civil War, a little bit of Latin American and Central American during the 1970s and 80s, and that's it. Today, foreign-born nationals in Mexico are less than 1 million people. That is less than 1% of the population. Yes.
Perhaps I wanted to get the same term we use, paradoxes of migration. I'm sorry if I didn't phrase my question correctly, but I was curious to know more about why is it that
I was answering like an academic and giving you the previous information to get to my point. I'm sorry. Yeah, the point is that Mexico understands very well immigration and it doesn't understand immigration or transmigration. And therefore, these policies regarding immigrants are mostly based on not knowing. And not knowing because only 18% of Mexicans say they have a relation with foreigners. And therefore, what you don't know well, you don't have you take shortcuts to make your decisions, and therefore it's very easy to make shortcuts about someone being non-documented and therefore not being and therefore not being in the right side of the law, and therefore they deserve to be deported. So that's the difference between what we request from our Mexican nationals in the U.S. because we know about this migration for over a century, but it's very new to have immigrants and transmigrants through Mexican territory, and therefore probably that is the reason why. Not knowing gives you this kind of answers by Mexicans.
Well, and just to conclude, starting from where you left off, Mexico obviously is a country that sends immigrants. It's not used to receiving. Brazil is precisely the opposite. What we had in the last 20 years of Brazilians leaving was kind of an anomaly. It's over. Okay, it has reversed again, and you have now the total population of Brazilians living abroad is 1.5% of Brazil's population. That's why you get that very low number when you talk about remittances. Meaning, actually, there are some Brazilians living abroad that are not sending money home. Mm-hmm. They are just 1% sending money, and we are 1.5% of the population is abroad. The other thing, and this ties directly into education, we are starting to import people, better people, well-trained people, because precisely to cover the deficit, because there is huge demand. Until when can Brazil wait to improve its education? Cannot wait anymore. That's why bring whoever is qualified to work here in Brazil. Is a country open to immigrants. You go to São Paulo, we have an Italian accent, the way we speak Portuguese, and the South even more. And so the country benefits from this sort of thing, and it's not by accident that education, that something called science without borders has become a very high priority to President Dilma Rousseff, because she knows what the problem is. The business community telling her all the time and telling the public, please find me educated people because we need better prepared people to keep going, okay? And so it is, and one final observation, it would be possible to frame some questions to capture this that I find fascinating about Brazil. Our deficits in education, I think, are mostly, obviously, we have to make secondary education universal. We have to open even more the doors for universities. I think 25% of the Brazilian kids are at university now, which is very low. But there is something that's happening that's fascinating, goes more or less against this idea of Brazil isolating itself. If it was possible to get separate younger age groups and by income levels, people that reach university. The most popular university course in Brazil today is international relations. So the idea that Brazil has to connect more is very much present among those Brazilians that are given the opportunity to go to improve themselves. But this is now with that I wanted to thank Guadalupe Gonzalez and Jorge Schiavon very, very much for this wonderful presentation on behalf of Andrew and Cindy and myself, and I'd like to obviously thank also our discussants, Kevin Casasamora, Stephen Johnson, and Peter Hakim, and on behalf again of Andrew Seeley from the Mexico Institute, Cindy Arnson from the Latin American Program. Thank you very much. And just if I can, a little advertising on for the Brazil Institute. If you're interested in citizen security efforts to try to deal with violence in the urban space, we will have on the 13th of December in the morning a very interesting session about the unities of pacifying police in the city of Rio de Janeiro. 2 studies, 2 surveys conducted about that. If you cannot come here, turn on your computer and because it will be webcast. Thank you very much and come back.